They say every Luna is chosen by the moon goddess herself. But what happens when the goddess chooses wrong? My name is Celine Vale, and for 3 years I wore a crown that never fit. While every wolf in the Shadowfang kingdom could tear through flesh and bone before their 18th winter, I stood silent. No shift, no power, just a human heart beating in a world built for predators. They called me the broken Luna, the weak queen, the mistake that would destroy us all. And the man who swore to love me? He believed them. Stick around till the end to see how the weakest wolf in the kingdom became the one thing they all feared. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my pack is watching. The first time Celine truly understood she was unwanted, she was standing in a pool of her own blood. Not from battle, not from honor, from shame. The throne room of Shadowfang Keep stretched out before her like a cathedral built for gods she would never become. Stone pillars rose 40 feet to vaulted ceilings where torches cast shadows that danced like mocking spirits. Every surface had been carved by wolves who understood power, who lived it, who breathed it into the very walls. The floor beneath her feet was polished obsidian, dark as the heart of the kingdom itself, and right now it reflected her face back at her with brutal honesty. She looked small, mortal, breakable. Around her, the royal court had gathered for the monthly strength gathering, where warriors demonstrated their power and young wolves presented their first shifts to the kingdom. The air thrummed with barely contained violence, that electric charge that came when apex predators gathered in one space. Every breath carried the scent of dominance, territorial aggression, and the copper tang of the blood sport to come. Celine stood alone in the center of it all, wearing a dress the color of moonlight that had cost more than most families earned in a year. It fit her perfectly. It made her look like a queen, and it couldn't hide the fact that beneath the silk and silver threading, she was still just human. The Queen Mother sat on a throne to the right of the king's seat, her spine straight as a blade, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already severe features into something carved from ice. Morgana Draven had ruled as regent for 20 years before her son took the crown, and she had never quite forgiven him for choosing a weak mate when he finally claimed his throne. She was speaking now, her voice carrying across the throne room with the kind of authority that made even the strongest warriors straighten their backs. The Queen Mother's eyes never left Celine. Nobody speaks to the Luna like that. Nobody except Morgana Draven. Because when you can't shift, when you can't fight, when you can't even summon the basic rage that every other wolf manifests before puberty, you're not really a Luna at all. You're just a woman wearing a crown that belongs to someone stronger. Every wolf in the kingdom knows it. Every warrior who kneels before the throne sees it. And the Alpha King himself, the man who once swore the mate bond was sacred and unbreakable, he's starting to believe it too. The warrior currently demonstrating his first shift was named Garrett, 17 years old, broad-shouldered, and arrogant in the way young wolves are when they first taste their own power. His bones cracked and reformed with wet snapping sounds that echoed off the stone walls. Fur erupted from skin that split and healed in the same breath. Within seconds, a massive gray wolf stood where the boy had been, its eyes burning gold with predatory intelligence. The court erupted in approval. Howls and shouts of praise. Warriors thumped their fists against their chests in the traditional salute of respect. Celine clapped politely, her hands coming together in soft, measured beats that nobody could hear over the celebration. Morgana's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. All eyes turned to the Queen Mother, then slowly, inevitably, to Celine. The applause died. The celebration drained out of the room like water through a broken dam. In its place came something worse: pity, disgust. The uncomfortable silence of people watching someone be publicly gutted. Celine's hands stilled in mid-clap. She lowered them slowly to her sides, fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. Not because she was preparing to fight. She had no fight in her. But because sometimes when you're drowning, you grab onto anything just to feel like you're not sinking. She could feel Kael's presence on the throne to her left. Alpha King of the Shadowfang Kingdom, the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. The man who had chosen her as his mate 3 years ago when the bond had snapped into place between them with the force of divine intervention. He wasn't looking at her. He never looked at her anymore. Morgana continued, her voice dropping to something quieter, more dangerous. The court murmured agreement. Heads nodded. Warriors who had knelt before Celine 1,000 times now looked at her like she was a tumor that needed cutting out. Celine forced herself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her before she died. The way you breathe when you're trying not to cry in front of people who would enjoy watching you break. She had practiced this. Standing in front of mirrors in her chambers, forcing her face into neutral masks while she imagined every possible humiliation. She had prepared speeches, clever responses, dignified deflections. She had built walls around her heart out of every self-help philosophy and inner strength mantra she could find. None of it worked when you were actually standing in the center of a room full of predators who wanted you gone. Her voice came out steady, small but steady. She hated how it sounded, like a child trying to convince adults she deserved a seat at their table. Morgana's smile was the kind wolves gave before they went for the throat. Celine's breath caught. She felt the words hit her chest like physical blows, each one designed to land in the exact place that would hurt most. Because that was the truth nobody said out loud, but everyone knew. The mate bond was sacred, unbreakable, chosen by the moon goddess herself. But the mate bond didn't care about politics. It didn't care about strength or kingdoms or the fact that an alpha king needed a Luna who could stand beside him in battle, not behind him in safety. The mate bond had chosen Celine, and everyone in the kingdom believed it was a mistake. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to say something, anything, that would prove she was more than the weakness they saw. Kael's voice filled the throne room like thunder rolling across mountains. Every head turned. Every wolf in the room focused on their king, the one voice that mattered more than any other. Celine felt something crack in her chest. Some small, foolish part of her that had still believed he would defend her. That when the moment came, when the attacks became too much, he would remember the mate bond. Remember the nights they had spent together when he still touched her like she was precious. Remember that he had chosen her. But Kael wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his mother with an expression Celine couldn't quite read. Something between exhaustion and resignation. Morgana's smile widened a fraction. Victory looked good on her. The court session continued. More warriors demonstrated their shifts. More young wolves proved their worth to the kingdom. And Celine stood in the center of it all, a ghost in a moonlight dress, slowly understanding that she had already lost. When the gathering finally ended 3 hours later, Celine walked through the corridors of Shadowfang Keep with her head high and her hands steady. She smiled at the servants who quickly averted their eyes. She nodded at the warriors who stepped aside to let her pass, their respect more reflex than genuine feeling. She made it all the way to her chambers before her legs gave out. The room was too large, too ornate, too empty. A bed big enough for 2 people who never shared it anymore. Wardrobes full of beautiful dresses she wore to look like a queen. Windows that overlooked the kingdom she was supposed to help rule but had no power to protect. Celine collapsed onto the stone floor beside her bed, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally, let herself shatter. She didn't make a sound. Wolves had better hearing than humans. If she cried too loudly, someone would hear. Someone would know. And knowing was weakness, and weakness was the one thing she couldn't afford to show any more than she already did just by existing. So she cried silently, her body shaking with sobs that had nowhere to go, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the polished stone floor, where they pooled like tiny mirrors reflecting a woman who didn't recognize herself anymore. How long could you love someone who was learning to hate you? How many times could you stand in a room full of people calling you worthless before you started believing them? How much of yourself could you lose before there was nothing left to save? She didn't have answers, she just had this moment, this room, this desperate drowning feeling that she was running out of time to prove she was worth keeping. The door opened. Celine's head snapped up, her hands immediately moving to wipe away tears, to fix her face into something acceptable. But it was too late. Whoever had entered had already seen her on the floor, broken and crying, like the weak human everyone believed her to be. Kael stood in the doorway. He looked like a king. 6'4" of pure muscle and controlled power, dark hair that fell to his shoulders, eyes the color of amber that could burn with rage or freeze with calculation depending on what the moment required. He wore simple black clothing, no crown, no ceremonial armor. He didn't need decoration. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge. Once Celine had loved looking at him, now she could barely stand it. They stared at each other across the room. Mates who lived in the same castle, but different worlds. Kael spoke first, his voice quieter than she expected. Celine pushed herself to her feet, using the bed for support. Her legs shook, but held. She forced herself to meet his eyes, even though everything in her wanted to look away. His jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face that might have been pain or might have been irritation. With Kael, it was getting harder to tell. The words hit her like a slap. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Celine's hands curled into fists at her sides. 3 years of swallowing her pride. 3 years of smiling through humiliation. 3 years of trying to be enough for a man who was slowly realizing she never would be. Something in her chest twisted, and for the first time in months, it wasn't fear or sadness. It was rage. Her voice came out low, shaking with an emotion she didn't have a name for. Kael's eyes flashed. For a second, just a second, she saw his wolf rise to the surface. The predator that lived beneath the man. The alpha who didn't tolerate challenges. Then it was gone, buried under layers of control that he had spent a lifetime building. The truth of it hung in the air between them like smoke. Celine felt something inside her go very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks beyond repair. The silence stretched. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Shadowfang Kingdom, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in the castle, wolves were laughing, training, living the lives they were born to live. And in this room, 2 people who were supposed to be soulmates stood on opposite sides of a gap that was getting wider every day. Finally, Kael spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a decision he had been avoiding for too long. Celine's world tilted. The floor seemed to drop away beneath her feet. She heard the words, understood them individually, but together they formed a sentence that couldn't possibly be real. Her voice came out as a whisper. Kael's expression was carefully neutral. The face of a king making a political decision, not a mate breaking a sacred bond. The name hit her like a physical blow. Lyanna Frost, daughter of the Ironclaw Pack Alpha, a warrior who had earned her rank through blood and victory. Beautiful, powerful, and everything Celine was not. She had been visiting the court for months now, officially as an emissary, but everyone with eyes could see the way she looked at Kael, the way she moved through the castle like she already owned it, the way the warriors respected her and the Queen Mother praised her, the way Kael didn't push her away when she stood too close. Celine's vision blurred, not with tears this time, with something darker, something that tasted like betrayal and felt like the world ending. Something in Celine's chest finally, irrevocably, shattered. She didn't scream, didn't throw things, didn't fall apart the way she wanted to. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height, pulled together every last scrap of dignity she had left, and looked her mate in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. She turned away from him, walked to the window, and stared out at the kingdom that had never wanted her. Behind her, she heard Kael hesitate, heard him take a breath like he wanted to say something, heard the moment he decided there was nothing left to say. The door closed. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Celine stood at the window and watched the last light drain from the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, something was waking up inside her, something that had been dormant so long she had forgotten it existed. It wasn't her wolf. She had long since accepted that would never come. It was something else, something older, something that had been waiting for this exact moment when she had nothing left to lose. A voice whispered through her mind, ancient and patient and cold as winter itself. Celine's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window glass. Same face, same body, same weak, powerless human who couldn't shift or fight or protect herself. But the eyes looking back at her now were different. They were done breaking. They were ready to burn. And in the frozen north, where ancient bloodlines slept beneath snow and ice, something felt her rage and stirred in recognition. The weak Luna was about to disappear. What came back would make them all kneel. Celine didn't sleep that night. She stood at the window until the sky turned from black to gray, watching the kingdom wake up below her. Servants lighting fires, guards changing shifts, wolves heading to the training grounds where they would spend the morning proving they were exactly what she wasn't. Strong, capable, worth keeping. Her reflection in this glass looked like a stranger. Same face, same body, but something behind the eyes had changed. Something had calcified in the hours since Kael walked out. The part of her that had spent 3 years trying to earn approval, trying to be softer and quieter and less of a burden, that part had finally suffocated under the weight of its own futility. What remained was harder, colder, and so tired of breaking. She turned from the window as the first rays of dawn cut across the stone floor. Her chambers felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and empty and full of things that belonged to a dead woman. The dresses in the wardrobe, the jewelry in the carved wooden boxes, the crown she wore to formal events, delicate silver that sat on her head like a beautiful lie. None of it was hers. It belonged to the Luna. And the Luna was something she had never truly been allowed to become. Celine walked to the wash basin and splashed cold water on her face. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected them to shake, expected some physical manifestation of the fact that her entire world had ended in a single conversation. But her body was calm even as her mind raced through possibilities, contingencies, the brutal mathematics of what came next. Kael wanted to bring another woman into their marriage. The Queen Mother would approve, the court would celebrate, and Celine would be expected to smile through it all, to stand beside her mate while he bound himself to someone stronger, to watch the kingdom she had tried so hard to serve embrace her replacement with open arms. The alternative was rejection, divorce, being cast out of the kingdom as a failed Luna, sent back to whatever remained of her birth pack with the mark of inadequacy branded across her soul. Both options felt like dying slowly versus dying fast. Neither felt like living. She dressed in simple traveling clothes. Dark wool pants, a loose tunic, boots worn soft from use. Not the ceremonial gowns or elegant dresses that marked her as royalty. Just fabric and leather that would let her move without being noticed. Because somewhere between midnight and dawn, in the hours she spent staring into darkness, Celine had made a decision that felt less like choice and more like the only possible action left to someone with nothing to lose. She was leaving, not in some dramatic display of defiance, not with speeches or confrontations or final words that would echo through the castle. Just a quiet exit in the early morning hours before the court woke up, before Kael noticed, before anyone could stop her or convince her or drag her back to a life that was killing her one humiliation at a time. She would disappear. Let them think whatever they wanted. Let them believe she couldn't handle the pressure, or had run away in shame, or had finally accepted her own worthlessness. It didn't matter anymore what they thought. The only thing that mattered was getting out before she completely forgot who she was beneath the crown. Celine packed light, a worn leather satchel with dried food, a water skin, a small knife that had belonged to her mother, and a single change of clothes. She left behind the jewelry, the dresses, the crown. Let the next Luna wear them. Let Liana Frost drape herself in Celine's cast-offs while she warmed Celine's bed and took Celine's place and proved to everyone that this was how it should have been from the start. She was reaching for the door when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Celine froze. Her hand hovered over the handle. The footsteps were too light to be Kael, too purposeful to be a servant. They stopped directly outside her door. A knock. 3 precise raps against wood. A woman's voice, cultured and cold. Every muscle in Celine's body tensed. Morgana Draven, the Queen Mother who had spent 3 years making it clear that Celine was a mistake, a weakness, a stain on the royal bloodline that needed removing. And now she was here, at dawn, at Celine's door. This couldn't be coincidence. Celine considered not answering, considered slipping out onto the balcony and climbing down the exterior wall like she had practiced in the dead of night when the castle felt like a prison and she needed to remember what freedom tasted like. But running from Morgana now would only confirm every terrible thing the woman believed about her. So Celine opened the door. Morgana stood in the corridor like a monument to controlled power. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that made her silver hair look like frost on blood. Her posture was perfect. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her eyes swept over Celine with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Those eyes dropped to the satchel in Celine's hand, lingered there for a moment that stretched too long. When Morgana's gaze returned to Celine's face, there was something in it that might have been satisfaction. The look of a predator who had correctly predicted exactly where the prey would run. Morgana's voice was silk over steel. Celine's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to push past the woman and run. But she had spent 3 years learning to navigate the politics of this court, and the first rule was never let them see you panic. She kept her voice level. Morgana's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. She stepped into the room without invitation, and Celine had no choice but to step back or be physically moved. The Queen Mother walked to the center of the chamber, her eyes cataloging the mostly untouched room, the packed bag, the traveling clothes. When she turned back to Celine, her expression was almost gentle. Almost. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through every defense Celine had constructed. Morgana continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining simple mathematics to a slow child. Celine felt something hot and vicious rise in her throat. She swallowed it back down. Getting angry at Morgana was like getting angry at a storm, pointless and self-destructive. Morgana moved to the window, looked out over the kingdom with the proprietary gaze of someone who had ruled it long before Kael took the throne. She turned back to Celine, and now there was something almost like respect in her eyes. The kind of respect wolves gave to prey that finally stopped running and turned to face the slaughter. Celine's voice came out rougher than she intended. The Queen Mother's smile widened a fraction. The offer hung in the air between them, cruel in its mercy, vicious in its practicality. A way out that wouldn't be running. A way to leave with something that looked like dignity instead of defeat. Celine stared at the woman who had made her life unbearable and saw, for the first time, that Morgana didn't hate her. Morgana simply saw the world in terms of strength and weakness, and had long ago decided which category Celine belonged to. This wasn't personal. It was just inevitable. Somehow, that made it worse. Celine's hands curled into fists at her sides. Morgana nodded, and something that might have been approval flickered across her features. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and looked back one final time. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor like the closing notes of a funeral dirge. Celine stood alone in her chambers with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Stay and be humiliated. Leave and be free. The mathematics were brutally simple. She picked up her satchel, took one last look at the room that had been her cage for 3 years, and walked out without closing the door behind her. Let them find it open. Let them draw whatever conclusions they wanted. She was done performing for an audience that had already decided she didn't deserve the stage. The castle was still mostly asleep. Celine moved through corridors she had memorized during countless sleepless nights, avoiding the main halls where early rising servants would be starting their duties. She took the back staircases, the forgotten passages, the routes that guards didn't patrol because they led to parts of the keep that no one important ever visited. She was almost to the eastern gate when she heard voices. Celine pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadow of a stone archway. The voices were coming from a courtyard just ahead, male, familiar. One of them was Kael. She should have kept moving, should have taken a different route, but something in her needed to hear this, needed the confirmation that leaving was the only rational choice left. She edged closer to the archway, careful to stay out of sight, and listened. That was Kael's voice, strained, tired in a way she hadn't heard before. Another man spoke, deeper voice, Garrett, Kael's second, his most trusted warrior. A long pause. The sound of footsteps pacing across stone. Kael's voice came out quieter. Garrett's response was immediate. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither man wanted to say. Finally, Kael spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a king making a political calculation that was tearing him apart. Celine's breath caught in her throat. She pressed harder against the stone wall, as if the pressure could keep her heart from shattering all over again, because that was what it came down to. Not love, not the mate bond, not 3 years of trying to build something together, just cold political reality. A king needed a strong Luna. The kingdom needed reassurance, and Celine was nothing but a liability dressed up in silk and crown. Garrett's voice was careful. Kael's response was raw in a way that made Celine want to scream. She didn't wait to hear more. Couldn't stand there listening to him justify destroying her for the good of the kingdom. She pushed away from the wall and moved through the shadows toward the eastern gate, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. The guards at the gate were young, new recruits who probably didn't even recognize her out of formal dress. They barely glanced at her as she slipped past, just another early morning traveler heading out into the kingdom. The moment she crossed the threshold, something in her chest loosened. Not relief, not freedom, just the absence of suffocation. The ability to breathe without feeling like the air itself was judging her. Celine walked away from Shadowfang Keep without looking back. The forest beyond the castle grounds was dense with ancient trees whose roots ran deeper than memory. This was old territory, the kind of wilderness that existed before wolves built kingdoms and decided some were worthy and some were not. The air smelled of pine and damp earth and the particular coldness that came from elevation. Celine had been walking for 2 hours when she finally stopped beside a stream to drink. Her hand shook as she knelt by the water. Now that she was alone, now that there was no court to witness her weakness, the adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was draining away, leaving behind exhaustion, grief, the particular kind of emptiness that came from severing yourself from everything you had built your identity around. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the stream, the same face that had looked back at her from the darkened window last night. But now there was no castle behind her, no crown, no title. Just a woman alone in the woods with no plan beyond getting as far away as possible. The voice in her head was back, that ancient, patient whisper that had stirred last night when everything fell apart. Celine spoke out loud, her voice rough. The presence in her mind shifted. It wasn't her wolf. She had given up on that years ago. But it was something that had been sleeping beneath her consciousness for so long she had stopped noticing it was there. The voice sounded amused. Celine stood up from the stream, water dripping from her chin. Her hands were steadier now. Her breathing had evened out. She looked north toward the mountains that rose in the distance like jagged teeth against the sky, the frozen lands, the territories beyond the kingdom's borders where ancient clans had retreated centuries ago, where wolves who didn't fit into pack politics went to disappear, where the strong survived and the weak died quickly enough that nature didn't have to waste time on them. If she was going to leave, she might as well go somewhere no one would follow, somewhere she could finally stop pretending to be something she wasn't, somewhere she could either become what she was meant to be or die trying. Both options felt better than going back. Celine adjusted the straps on her satchel and started walking north. The forest grew denser as she traveled, older. The trees here had seen centuries pass. Their branches blocked out so much sunlight that the ground beneath was perpetual twilight. The sounds of the kingdom faded behind her, replaced by the particular silence of wilderness that had never been tamed. She walked until her legs ached and the sun was high overhead, until the stream beside her had narrowed to a trickle and the ground beneath her feet had turned from soft earth to rocky terrain, until the air grew thin and cold and every breath burned her lungs. She was somewhere beyond the kingdom's borders now, beyond the territory that Shadowfang patrols monitored, beyond the reach of Kael's authority, or Morgana's judgment, or the court's collective contempt. Out here, she was no one. Nothing. Just meat and bone that would feed the forest if she couldn't figure out how to survive. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like relief. She found a hollow beneath an overhanging rock formation as the sun started to set. It wasn't much. Just enough space to keep the wind off and a clear view of the surrounding area in case something decided she looked like dinner. She gathered fallen branches for a fire, struck the flint she had packed, and watched sparks catch on dry moss until flames licked at the wood. The fire pushed back the darkness but couldn't touch the cold that was settling into her bones. This far north, even summer nights dropped below freezing. Without a wolf's natural heat regulation, without the ability to shift and let fur protect her from the elements, she was going to freeze before morning. Celine pulled her cloak tighter and huddled closer to the flames. Her teeth chattered. Her fingers were already going numb. This was how humans died in the wild. Not from predators or starvation, but from simple exposure. The cold crept in degree by degree until you stopped shivering and started feeling warm, and then you went to sleep and never woke up. She had maybe 3 hours before hypothermia became irreversible. The voice in her head was quieter now, almost sad. Celine's laugh came out as a chattering gasp. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the voice, or to herself, or to the moon goddess, who had apparently decided 3 years ago that Celine Vale deserved to be broken, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The fire crackled. The forest whispered with night sounds, and Celine sat in her hollow beneath the rock and felt the cold sink deeper. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just to rest. The exhaustion from walking all day was catching up with her, dragging her down toward sleep even as her body screamed that sleeping right now was death. She would just rest for a minute. Just close her eyes and let the fire warm her a bit more, before she started walking again, before she found better shelter, before she figured out how to survive the night. Just 1 minute. The voice in her head was screaming now, but it sounded so far away. Celine's consciousness was fading when she felt it. Heat, not from the fire, from inside. A warmth that started in her chest and spread outward through her limbs like liquid sunlight, like something that had been locked away for decades was finally breaking free. Her eyes snapped open. The fire in front of her wasn't orange anymore. It was white, burning so hot it hurt to look at, and the flames were bending toward her, reaching, responding to something she wasn't doing consciously. Celine lifted her hand and watched frost crystallize along her fingertips. Not from the cold, from her. The air around her hand was freezing even as the rest of her body burned with that strange internal heat. The voice in her head wasn't whispering anymore. It was roaring. Celine tried to stand and her legs gave out. She collapsed against the rock wall, gasping as power she didn't understand flooded through her system. Her vision blurred, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every nerve ending in her body was screaming that something fundamental was changing. This was shifting. It had to be. After 21 years of silence, her wolf was finally waking up. But it didn't feel like the shifts she had watched 1,000 times in the throne room. This was older, colder. Something that predated pack politics and kingdom borders and everything she thought she understood about what wolves were supposed to be. The world tilted. Darkness rushed in. And the last thing Celine saw before consciousness left her was the white fire consuming everything and her own hands glowing like captured moonlight. When she woke, the fire was dead and the sun was rising and she was still alive. Celine lay on the ground where she had fallen, her body aching like she had been beaten. Every muscle screamed. Her bones felt wrong, like they had broken and healed overnight. Her skin was too sensitive. Her senses were too sharp. She could hear a rabbit moving through underbrush 50 yards away. Could smell the morning dew on pine needles and the lingering scent of smoke and something else. Something wild and ancient and completely unfamiliar. Her own scent. Changed. No longer fully human. Celine pushed herself to sitting and looked down at her hands. They looked normal. Same size, same shape. But when she focused, when she reached for that heat that had nearly killed her last night, frost spread across her palms like living crystal. She had a wolf. After 21 years of nothing, she finally had a wolf. But this wasn't what she had expected. Wasn't what she had spent 3 years desperately wishing for while the court mocked her weakness. This power felt wrong, dangerous, like it had been locked away for good reason, and she had just blown open the door. The voice in her head was purring now. Celine's hands were shaking as she stared at the frost melting on her skin. She should have felt triumph, should have felt vindication, should have felt anything other than this growing dread that she had just stepped across a threshold she didn't understand and couldn't walk back through. Because this power, whatever it was, it had been dormant in her bloodline for generations, locked away so deep that even her parents hadn't known it existed. And now it was awake, responding to her, changing her into something that wasn't quite wolf and wasn't quite human and definitely wasn't the weak Luna everyone had believed her to be. The question was what came next. Return to the kingdoms? Show Kael and Morgana and the entire court that she wasn't worthless after all? Watch them scramble to take back every humiliation, every insult, every moment they had made her feel small? The thought made her sick. Or stay here. Learn to control this power, become something strong enough that she never had to answer to anyone ever again. That thought made her heart race. Celine stood on shaking legs and looked north toward the mountains. Somewhere up there, in the frozen peaks where ancient bloodlines had retreated to die, there might be answers. There might be someone who could teach her what she was becoming. There might be a future that didn't involve crowns or courts or mate bonds that shattered under political pressure. She started walking, not back toward the kingdom. North. Deeper into territory that would kill her if she wasn't strong enough to survive it. And for the first time in 3 years, Celine Vale felt something other than fear. She felt hungry. The northern mountains didn't care if you were royal or broken or running from a life that had tried to kill you slowly. They just waited to see if you were strong enough to survive them. Celine had been walking for 6 days. 6 days of climbing through terrain that got steeper and colder with every mile. 6 days of surviving on whatever she could forage or catch. 6 days of pushing her newly awakened power to its limits just to stay alive in an environment designed to kill anything weak enough to give it the chance. The frost that spread from her fingertips had saved her life 3 times already. Once when a mountain cat decided she looked like prey. Once when she lost her footing on an icy cliff face and managed to freeze handholds into the rock. And once when the temperature dropped so low that hypothermia would have taken her before dawn if she hadn't figured out how to generate heat from the strange power burning in her chest. But the power was unpredictable. Sometimes it responded instantly. Sometimes it flickered and died. And sometimes it surged so violently that she had to fight to keep it from consuming her completely. She was learning through trial and error, through near-death experiences that taught her faster than any mentor ever could, through sheer desperation and the knowledge that out here weakness didn't earn sympathy. It earned burial beneath snow that wouldn't melt until spring. On the 7th day, she found the village. It wasn't marked on any map, wasn't visible from the main mountain passes. Just a collection of stone structures built into the mountainside, smoke rising from chimneys, and the unmistakable scent of wolves living in close quarters. Celine approached carefully. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to avoid other wolves, to keep moving until she found some isolated cave where she could figure out her power in solitude. But she was running out of supplies, running out of strength, and the mountains ahead looked even more brutal than what she had already crossed. She needed help. Even if asking for it felt like admitting defeat, the village guards saw her before she reached the outer perimeter. 2 massive wolves materialized from the tree line, their size suggesting they were warriors who had survived enough battles to earn their positions. They didn't shift to human form, just flanked her on either side, teeth bared, making it clear that one wrong move would be her last. Celine raised her hands slowly, showing empty palms. No weapons, no threat. Just exhaustion and desperation written across every line of her body. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. 7 days of barely speaking had done that. The wolves didn't respond, just herded her toward the village like they were bringing in a suspected threat. She caught glimpses of faces watching from windows, children being pulled inside, warriors moving into defensive positions. They thought she was dangerous. The irony would have been funny if she wasn't so tired. They brought her to the largest structure in the village, a longhouse built from ancient timber and stone, with carvings along the doorframe that predated any kingdom Celine knew. The guards shifted to human form as they entered, 2 men in their 30s with scars that told stories of violence survived. Inside, an elderly woman sat beside a fire that burned blue-white instead of orange. Her hair was the color of fresh snow. Her eyes were pale as ice. And when she looked at Celine, there was recognition in her gaze that made Celine's breath catch. The woman's voice was like wind over frozen lakes. Celine's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the stone floor, exhaustion and shock finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had kept her moving for a week. One of the guards moved to grab her, but the old woman raised a hand. The guard hesitated, then stepped back. Celine knelt on the cold floor, trembling with fatigue and something else. Something that felt like the moment before a truth you weren't ready for shattered everything you thought you knew about yourself. The old woman stood and moved closer. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but power radiated from her like heat from a forge. When she reached out and touched Celine's face, her fingers were ice cold and impossibly gentle. She examined Celine the way a jeweler might examine a stone, looking for flaws, for authenticity, for the truth hidden beneath the surface. Finally, she stepped back and nodded to herself. The words hit Celine like a physical blow. White Wolf Clan. She had heard the name once, years ago, in a history lesson that the tutor had glossed over because everyone knew the White Wolves were extinct, dead for centuries, wiped out in the wars that had consolidated power among the major packs. Her voice was barely a whisper. The old woman's expression softened into something that might have been pity. She gestured to the guards. Celine wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, wanted to understand what this woman saw in her that triggered recognition of a bloodline that shouldn't exist anymore. But exhaustion was dragging her down into darkness, and her body was shutting down whether she wanted it to or not. The last thing she saw before consciousness left her was the blue-white fire burning in the hearth, and the old woman watching her with eyes that had seen centuries pass. When Celine woke, she was lying on a bed of furs in a small room carved directly into the mountainside. Light filtered through a narrow window. Her body ached, but the desperate exhaustion had faded. Someone had cleaned her wounds, changed her clothes, and left food and water on a low table beside the bed. She sat up slowly, testing her limbs. Everything worked. Nothing was broken. She was just sore in the particular way that came from pushing your body past every reasonable limit and then asking it to keep going anyway. The door opened and the old woman entered, carrying a clay pot that steamed with something that smelled like herbs and snow. She set the pot on the table and settled onto a cushion across from Celine with the kind of grace that came from joints that still remembered how to move. Celine's hands curled into the furs beneath her. The old woman's smile was sad. She poured liquid from the pot into 2 cups and handed one to Celine. The steam rising from it was cold instead of hot. When Celine touched the cup, frost formed along the rim. The old woman drank from her own cup, then set it down carefully. The name settled over Celine like a shroud. Era. Ice. Fitting for someone whose eyes looked like frozen lakes and whose presence made the air temperature drop. Celine took a small sip from her cup. The liquid was cold enough to burn, but it spread warmth through her chest when she swallowed. The same warmth that had saved her life that first night in the forest. Era nodded as if Celine had spoken out loud. Over the next hour, Era told her a story that rewrote everything Celine thought she knew about her own bloodline. The White Wolf clan had been the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories 3 centuries ago. They hadn't ruled through political alliances or military conquest. They had ruled through pure elemental power, the ability to command ice and snow and the killing cold of winter itself. Wolves whose eyes burned silver white and whose presence could freeze rivers solid. They had been feared, respected, and eventually targeted. The other packs had united against them, not in open war. That would have been suicide. But through betrayal, through poison that weakened their power, through assassinations that picked them off one by one until only scattered survivors remained. Those survivors had gone into hiding. Some had tried to blend into other packs, suppressing their power to avoid recognition. Others had fled to the far north where the mountains were too brutal for pursuit. Over generations, the bloodline had diluted. The power had gone dormant. Children were born without any sign of the abilities that had once defined their ancestors, until eventually the White Wolf clan became a ghost story, something that had existed once but was gone now, dead and buried beneath centuries of pack politics and territorial expansion. Except the power never truly died. It just waited, sleeping in bloodlines that had forgotten they were anything other than ordinary, waiting for the right combination of circumstance and desperation to wake it up again. Era looked at Celine with those ice-pale eyes. Celine's hands were shaking. The cup trembled in her grip, liquid sloshing against the sides. Era's expression was carefully neutral. The question hung in the air between them. The question Celine had been avoiding since that first night when the power had nearly killed her. The question that had followed her through 6 days of brutal travel and desperate survival. What was she now? What had she become? Celine set down her cup before she dropped it. Era stood and walked to the window. She looked out over the village, her profile sharp against the light. Celine felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had spent 3 years being weak, being powerless, being the Luna who couldn't protect herself or her people or the mate bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. And now this woman was telling her she had access to power that could level kingdoms. The temptation was immediate and vicious. Go back to Shadowfang with abilities that would make Kyle and Morgana and every wolf who had mocked her kneel. Make them regret every insult, every humiliation, every moment they had made her feel worthless. But underneath the temptation was something darker. The knowledge that power like that changed you, made you into something that measured worth in dominance and strength, made you into the kind of person who would humiliate someone weaker just because you could, made you into the kind of person she had spent 3 years suffering under. Celine's voice came out quiet. Era turned from the window and smiled. It was the first genuine smile Celine had seen from her. The training started the next morning, and it was brutal in ways that made surviving the mountain journey look easy. Era was patient as stone and twice as unforgiving. She pushed Celine past exhaustion, past pain, past the point where most people would have quit. Because quitting in this environment meant dying, and dying meant wasting a bloodline that had survived 3 centuries of systematic extermination. Celine learned to call the frost without losing control, learned to shape ice into weapons and shields, learned to sense changes in temperature and use them to read her environment, learned to fight with the particular savagery that came from knowing your opponent wanted you dead, and your survival depended on being faster and meaner, and more willing to do whatever it took. She trained for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of waking before dawn and collapsing after dark. 6 weeks of discovering muscles she didn't know existed and pushing them until they tore and healed stronger. 6 weeks of becoming something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous than the woman who had fled Shadowfang Keep in the dead of night. The village wolves watched her progress with a mixture of awe and wariness. They knew what she was becoming, knew that the power she was learning to wield made her a threat to anyone who crossed her. But they also knew that she was the first white wolf to fully manifest in 3 generations, and that meant something to a people who had spent centuries barely surviving in exile. On the morning of the 43rd day, Ira told Celine she was ready for the final test. They climbed to a plateau high above the village where the air was so thin that breathing felt like drowning, where the temperature stayed below freezing even in full sunlight, where the only sound was wind howling across stone. Era stood at the center of the plateau and gestured for Celine to face her. Celine's heart was pounding, not from exertion, from understanding. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Pass, and she would have control over power that could reshape her future. Fail, and that power would consume her the way it had consumed others who weren't strong enough to master it. She took her position opposite Era and forced her breathing to steady. Era's eyes flashed silver white. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost spread across the ground between them like a living thing. Celine barely had time to raise her hands before ice formed around her feet, climbing up her legs, freezing her in place. She called her own power, felt it surge through her system. But Era's was older, stronger, controlled with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of practice. The ice reached her chest. Her breath came in gasps. Panic clawed at her mind because she was going to die here, frozen solid by the woman who had promised to teach her control. Era's voice cut through the panic like a blade. Celine's vision was going dark at the edges. The ice was crushing her ribs, making it impossible to breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to struggle, to do something. But fighting was what she had been doing for 6 weeks. Fighting was what had gotten her this far. What if the answer wasn't fighting? Celine stopped struggling, stopped trying to push back against Era's power. Instead, she reached for the cold that was killing her and pulled it into herself. Accepted it. Became it. The ice stopped spreading. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the frost began to retreat. Not because Era was releasing her, but because Celine was absorbing it, taking the killing cold and making it part of her own power, using it instead of fighting it. The ice shattered. Celine gasped and fell to her knees, coughing and shaking. But she was alive. And when she looked up at Era, the old woman was smiling. Era reached down and helped Celine to her feet. Celine stood on shaking legs and looked out over the plateau, looked down at the village below, looked north toward the even more brutal peaks that rose in the distance. She had survived, had learned control, had become something powerful enough that the mountains couldn't kill her anymore. The question was what she did with that power. Era seemed to read her thoughts. Celine turned to face her teacher, the woman who had taken a broken refugee and forged her into something dangerous. Era's expression was unreadable. The old woman walked to the edge of the plateau and looked south, toward the territories where kingdoms rose and fell, where pack politics determined who lived and who died, where Celine had spent 3 years being crushed under the weight of expectations she couldn't meet. When Era spoke again, her voice was quiet. Celine felt something cold settle in her chest. Going back had always been a possibility floating at the edges of her consciousness. The fantasy of returning with power and watching them all realize they had been wrong about her. But hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Era turned from the edge and fixed Celine with those ice-pale eyes. The question hit harder than any physical blow, because Celine knew the answer, had known it since that first night when Kael told her he was bringing another woman into their marriage. Since Morgana had made it clear that Selani's only value was her absence. Since she had walked away from a life that had been killing her one humiliation at a time. She wasn't going back for them. She was going back for herself, to prove that the woman they had broken was strong enough to rise, to show them that discarding someone didn't make them disappear. Sometimes it just made them dangerous. But underneath that truth was something uglier, the desire for revenge, for vindication, for the particular satisfaction that came from watching people who had hurt you finally understand what they had lost. And power like hers, power that could freeze blood in veins and stop hearts mid-beat, power that had been used to rule through fear for centuries before her ancestors were hunted to near extinction, that power made revenge easy, too easy. Celine met Era's gaze. Era nodded slowly. They descended from the plateau in silence. Celine's mind was racing with possibilities and consequences and the brutal mathematics of what came next. She had the power now, had the control, had 6 weeks of training that had turned her into something that could defend itself. But going back to Shadowfang meant facing Kael, meant standing in the throne room where she had been humiliated 1,000 times and proving she wasn't weak anymore, meant looking her mate in the eyes and deciding whether the bond that had once meant everything was worth salvaging or needed burning. She was so focused on those thoughts that she didn't notice the smell until they were halfway back to the village. Blood. Fresh. Too much of it. Era stopped walking. Her entire body went rigid. When she looked at Celine, there was something in her eyes that made Celine's stomach drop. They ran. The village was burning, not with normal fire, with something worse, something that melted stone and turned bone to ash. The longhouse where Celine had first met Era was a crater. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, wolves who had been killed mid-shift, their forms frozen between human and animal. The guards who had brought Celine in were dead. The children she had seen playing in the streets were gone. Everything that had been alive and thriving 40 minutes ago was now smoke and blood and silence. Celine stood at the edge of the destruction and felt her newly acquired control shatter into rage. Era was moving through the rubble, checking bodies, searching for survivors. Her face was carved from ice, but her hands were shaking. When she found a young woman crushed beneath burning timber, she made a sound Celine had never heard another living thing make. Something between a howl and a scream and the death of hope. Celine forced herself to move, to help search, to ignore the smell of burned flesh and the particular silence that came when an entire community had been erased. They found one survivor. A boy, maybe 12 years old, bleeding from wounds that would have killed an adult. He was barely conscious, but he grabbed Era's arm when she knelt beside him. His voice was a whisper. Era's face went white. Her hands curled into claws against the ground. The boy's grip tightened. Blood bubbled at his lips. His eyes were already glazing over. Shock and blood loss dragging him toward whatever came after life. But he forced out 3 more words before the light left him completely. Then he was gone, and Era was holding a corpse, and Celine was standing in the ruins of the only place that had shown her kindness since she left the kingdom. The old woman stood slowly, set the boy's body down gently. When she turned to face Celine, her eyes were burning with power barely contained. Celine's mind was racing. Shadowfang, the kingdom she had fled, the court that had rejected her. Someone from there had done this, had tracked her somehow, had decided that a village of exiled wolves harboring a runaway Luna was a threat worth eliminating, which meant Kael knew where she was, knew she had survived, knew she was becoming something powerful enough to threaten his careful political balance. And he had responded by ordering a massacre. The mate bond had once been sacred, unbreakable, chosen by forces neither of them controlled. But bonds could be severed, could be cut away like infected flesh if one party wanted freedom badly enough. And severing a mate bond required blood, required violence, required destroying everything the rejected mate had built so they had nothing left to return to. Celine's hands curled into fists, frost spread across her knuckles, sharp enough to draw blood. Era was watching her with an expression that might have been grief or might have been satisfaction. The words tasted like ash in Celine's mouth. But they were true. She had wanted control, wanted power, wanted the ability to defend herself. And now she had it. Now she was strong enough to stand against the kingdom that had tried to break her. The question was whether she was strong enough to burn it down. Era reached out and gripped Celine's shoulder. Her fingers were ice cold and her eyes were burning. They left the ruins of the village as the sun set, left behind bodies they couldn't bury and destruction they couldn't undo, left with the knowledge that power wasn't just about survival anymore. Now it was about vengeance. And Celine Vale, the weak Luna who couldn't shift, the broken woman who had fled into the mountains to die. She was walking back toward the kingdom that had tried to destroy her with ice in her veins and murder in her heart. The mate bond was severed. The court that had rejected her was about to learn what happened when you discarded something powerful enough to haunt you. Shadowfang Kingdom had forgotten one critical truth about power. The weakest wolf in the pack could still have the sharpest teeth. They just needed someone desperate enough to teach them where to bite. The journey back to Shadowfang Kingdom took 8 days, but it felt like descending into a previous life. Every mile closer to the castle walls was a mile deeper into territory that had tried to break her. Territory that still believed she was the weak Luna who had run away in shame. They were about to learn different. Celine traveled with Era and 3 other survivors from the village. Warriors who had been hunting in the far peaks when the attack happened. Wolves whose families were now ash and rubble. Wolves who wanted blood the same way Celine wanted air. They moved fast, slept little, spoke less. There was nothing left to say that mattered more than the silence of shared grief and the promise of violence to come. On the 6th day, they started seeing signs of Shadowfang patrols, wolves marking territory, guards stationed at points along the mountain passes. The kingdom had expanded its borders in the weeks since Celine left, pushing further into the wilderness, claiming land that didn't belong to them, hunting for threats that needed eliminating. Era studied the patrol patterns with the cold calculation of someone who had survived 3 centuries of pack politics. One of the warriors, a scarred man named Torin, whose daughter had burned in the attack, bared his teeth. Era's smile was sharp as broken glass. They waited until nightfall, until the patrols had settled into their rotations and the guards had grown comfortable in their belief that nothing dangerous existed this far from the castle. Until the moment when attention wandered and discipline softened and mistakes became lethal. Then they struck. Celine took the first guard herself. A young wolf barely 20 who had been staring south toward the kingdom instead of watching the darkness behind him. She moved silent as falling snow, and when her hand touched his neck, frost spread across his throat faster than he could scream. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened, and ice filled his lungs before sound could escape. He dropped without a noise, and Celine caught his body before it hit the ground, lowered him gently into the underbrush. The first life she had ever taken, the first person she had killed with power that had been dormant until desperation woke it. She waited for guilt, for horror, for some emotional response that matched the enormity of ending another living thing. Nothing came, just cold certainty that this man had been part of a kingdom that ordered massacres and called it politics. That he wore the colors of wolves who had decided a village of exiles was a threat worth burning. That his life meant less than the children who had died screaming because someone in Shadowfang Keep wanted Celine Vale erased from existence. The mathematics were brutally simple. Him or them. His life or justice for the dead. His breath or the satisfaction of watching Kyle Draven realize he had created something more dangerous than he could control. Celine stepped over the body and moved to the next guard. By the time the sun rose, 12 Shadowfang warriors were dead, and the survivors had a clear path to the kingdom's outer walls. They reached the forest edge overlooking Shadowfang Keep as dawn broke across the valley. The castle looked exactly as Celine remembered, stone walls rising from the earth like teeth, towers that scraped the sky, gates that could withstand siege armies, the seat of power for the strongest pack in the northern territories. Home. Once. Before she learned that home was just another word for the place that broke you slowly enough that you didn't notice until the damage was permanent. Ira stood beside her, eyes scanning the castle defenses with professional interest. Celine's jaw tightened. The front gates were designed to repel armies, walls built to withstand battering rams and siege weapons, defenses that assumed threats came from the outside in force. They weren't prepared for 5 wolves who had nothing left to lose and power that predated their kingdom by centuries. Torin moved up on her other side. His voice was rough from days of silence broken only for necessity. Celine turned to look at the warriors who had followed her here. Warriors who had lost everything, who had every reason to want her dead because she was the reason Shadowfang had found their village, who had chosen revenge over survival and followed the woman responsible for their grief straight into the heart of enemy territory. She owed them honesty. Torin's smile was vicious. The other warriors nodded, eyes burning with the particular light that came when grief hardened into something sharp enough to cut. Era spoke quietly. The warning hung in the air between them, because that was the truth nobody wanted to acknowledge. Power like theirs changed you, made you into something that measured problems in body counts, made you capable of horrors that would haunt you forever if you let yourself think about them too long, made you into the kind of monster kingdoms created and then pretended didn't exist until they needed someone to do the wet work. Celine looked at the castle where she had spent 3 years being crushed under the weight of inadequacy, looked at the throne room where Morgana had publicly humiliated her, looked at the chambers where Kael had told her he was bringing another woman into their marriage because Celine wasn't strong enough to rule beside him. She felt the frost spread across her fingertips, felt the power that had been dormant for 21 years respond to rage that had been building for far longer. Era nodded slowly. They moved under cover of forest until they reached the eastern wall. The same wall Celine had climbed down 2 months ago when she fled with nothing but a satchel and the desperate hope that dying in the mountains was better than dying slowly in the castle. The wall was 40 feet of smooth stone. Guards patrolled the top in regular intervals. Impossible to scale without being seen, unless you could freeze handholds into solid rock. Celine pressed her palms against the stone and felt the cold flow through her into the wall itself. Ice crystallized in patterns that looked natural, formations that provided grip without being obvious. A ladder made of winter itself. She climbed first, hand over hand, moving in the gaps between guard rotations. When she reached the top, she waited in shadow until a guard passed close enough. Then her hand shot out and frost spread across his throat before he could raise an alarm. She caught him as he fell, lowered him behind the battlement, and signaled the others to follow. They were inside Shadowfang Keep's defenses within 5 minutes. The inner courtyard was quiet. Pre-dawn stillness before the castle woke for morning routines. Servants would be lighting fires soon. Warriors would be heading to training grounds. The kingdom would begin its daily function like nothing was wrong, like they hadn't ordered a massacre 2 weeks ago, like innocent blood wasn't drying on their hands. Celine led her small group through corridors she had memorized during 3 years of sleepless nights, took them through servant passages and forgotten routes, past guard stations where warriors were changing shifts and too focused on their own routines to notice shadows moving just outside their perception. They reached the lower levels where the castle stored supplies and kept prisoners and maintained the infrastructure that made a kingdom function, where stone was older and thicker and sound didn't carry to the floors above, where screaming wouldn't wake the royal family. Era stopped at an intersection and turned to face the group. The warriors dispersed, silent as death, moving to their assigned positions. Torin went to secure the armory. 2 others headed for the guard barracks to block reinforcements. Era moved toward the dungeon level where political prisoners were kept and information was extracted through methods the court preferred not to acknowledge. Celine stood alone in the corridor and realized she was finally exactly where she needed to be. In the heart of the kingdom that had rejected her. Invisible and armed and so far past mercy that the concept felt like something she had read about once but never truly understood. She started walking toward the royal wing. The corridors grew more ornate as she climbed. Stone gave way to marble. Torches became chandeliers. The castle transformed from functional fortress to palace, designed to intimidate visiting dignitaries and remind everyone who set foot inside that Shadowfang kingdom was power incarnate. Celine had walked these halls 1,000 times wearing silk dresses and a crown that never fit, had smiled at nobles and warriors who looked through her like she was glass, had pretended not to notice the whispers that followed in her wake about weakness and inadequacy and the Alpha King's terrible choice in mates. Now she walked them in dark leather and boots that made no sound, with frost coating her fingertips and rage burning cold enough to freeze blood in veins, with the faces of dead children behind her eyes and justice on her tongue that tasted like winter itself. She was almost to the royal chambers when she heard voices, 2 guards stationed outside the king's door. Young, alert, hands on sword hilts. They saw her coming and their postures shifted to defensive before recognition hit. The taller one's eyes went wide. His hand moved for his sword. Not fast enough. Celine's palm touched his chest and ice spread beneath his armor faster than his heart could beat. He tried to scream, but frost was already climbing his throat, filling his lungs, turning him into a statue mid-breath. The second guard managed to draw his blade. got it halfway to striking position before Celine's other hand caught his wrist and froze the joint solid. Bone shattered beneath ice. He opened his mouth and she shoved her palm against his face and watched his features crystallize beneath her touch. Both guards dropped, frozen solid, eyes still open. Expressions locked in the moment they realized the weak Luna had returned as something worse. Celine stepped over their bodies and pushed open the door to the royal chambers. The room was exactly as she remembered. Too large, too ornate. A bed big enough for two people who never shared it anymore. Windows overlooking the kingdom. The space she had occupied for 3 years while slowly forgetting who she was beneath the weight of inadequacy. Kael was standing at the window, back to the door, shoulders tense beneath a loose shirt. He had heard the door open but hadn't turned around yet. His voice was rough, tired in a way she hadn't heard before. Celine closed the door behind her. The sound echoed in the silence. Kael turned. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Mates who had been bonded by forces neither understood, who had tried to build something together and watched it collapse under political pressure, and the brutal reality that love wasn't enough when kingdoms demanded strength. He looked older, thinner, like the 2 months since she disappeared had aged him years. Dark circles under his eyes, jaw tight with tension, the particular exhaustion that came from carrying weight you couldn't put down. Good. Let him hurt. Let him feel a fraction of what he put her through. His eyes swept over her, taking in the dark clothing, the warrior stance, the frost coating her fingers, the cold fury radiating from her like winter itself. His voice came out as barely a whisper. Celine's laugh was sharp enough to cut. Kael took a step toward her and stopped when ice crystallized on the floor between them. A warning. A barrier. The physical manifestation of everything that had broken between them. Celine's hands curled into fists. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. His eyes flashed, the alpha rising to the surface. The king who didn't tolerate being questioned. Kael's jaw worked. Something that might have been pain flickered across his features before control buried it. The words hit like physical blows, but Celine had spent 2 months building armor out of grief and rage. They couldn't touch her anymore. Kael's control was fracturing. She could see it in the tension across his shoulders, in the way his hands were shaking, in the desperation leaking through his carefully maintained composure. Celine cut him off. Kael went very still. The kind of stillness that came right before violence. Celine felt something crack open in her chest. All the grief she had been holding back, all the rage she had been channeling into ice and murder, all the desperate, drowning hurt of loving someone who chose politics over protection. The ice spreading from her hands was creeping up the walls now, frost-coating stone, temperature dropping until their breath came out as visible clouds. Kael was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Horror, awe, recognition that the woman he thought he knew had become something he never imagined possible. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Celine's vision blurred, but she refused to let tears fall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not now. Not after everything. The ice had reached the ceiling. The entire room was crystallizing, beautiful and deadly, and completely beyond her control, because rage was a living thing, and it wanted out. Kael took a step toward her, then another, walking straight through the barrier of ice she had created, his breath coming in visible clouds, frost forming on his skin. But he kept moving until he was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes, the genuine grief, the realization that he had destroyed something irreplaceable and no amount of political power could bring it back. His hand lifted like he wanted to touch her face, stopped inches away when more ice crystallized in the air between them. His voice broke on her name. Celine's control shattered. The ice exploded outward. Not in violence, in grief made manifest. Frost spreading across every surface. The bed where she had slept alone. The wardrobe full of dresses she had worn while pretending to be enough. The windows overlooking a kingdom that had never wanted her. Everything crystallized in the span of a heartbeat. Everything except Kael. She held the power back from him through sheer will, through the last shred of whatever the mate bond had been, before he severed it with politics and weakness and the choice to prioritize his throne over her heart. She looked at him standing in the center of a frozen room, looked at the man she had loved more than breathing. looked at the king who had chosen his kingdom over his queen and called it necessity. When she spoke, her voice was steady as stone. Kael's eyes were burning, not with anger, with grief that matched her own. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside broke the moment. Shouts. Steel on steel. The sounds of guards responding to a threat. Celine's warriors had been discovered, which meant they had minutes before this room was surrounded. Before the full force of Shadowfang's military came crashing down on 5 wolves who had been foolish enough to think rage was enough to topple a kingdom. Kael heard it too. His posture shifted. King instead of man. Alpha preparing for battle. Celine smiled. It was the coldest expression she had ever worn. She turned toward the door, toward the sounds of fighting, toward the kingdom that had rejected her, and the court that had mocked her, and the future that would be written in blood and ice, and the particular satisfaction of watching everything burn. But before she reached the door, before she could walk away from him forever, Kael's voice stopped her one final time. Celine looked back over her shoulder, at the man who had been her mate, at the king who had chosen wrong, at the alpha who had finally learned that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with words or time or the desperate hope that love would survive anything. Then she opened the door and walked straight into chaos. The corridor outside was a war zone, Shadowfang guards fighting Era and the survivors, blood on marble, bodies on the floor, the sounds of violence echoing through halls that had forgotten what real battles sounded like. Celine raised her hands and felt the power surge through her like a living thing, felt ice respond to rage that had been building for months, felt winter itself wake up inside her blood and demand release. The temperature plummeted, frost exploded across walls. Guards who had been advancing on her warriors suddenly found themselves frozen to the floor, weapons crystallized in their hands, breath turned to ice in their lungs. She walked through the carnage like a force of nature, untouchable, inevitable. The weak Luna transformed into something that made hardened warriors back away with fear in their eyes. Behind her, Kael emerged from the chambers. His voice carried the authority of an alpha king commanding his pack. The guards who weren't frozen hesitated, caught between orders and survival instinct, between loyalty to their king and the very rational fear of a woman who had just demonstrated she could kill them all without breaking stride. Era appeared at Celine's side, blood on her hands and ice in her eyes. They reached the throne room before the full guard complement could organize, burst through doors that had been designed to intimidate, strode into the space where Selani had been humiliated and rejected and slowly crushed beneath the weight of being inadequate. Morgana was there, standing beside the throne like she still ruled, like her son hadn't taken the crown years ago, like she would always be the real power behind Shadowfang Kingdom. The Queen Mother's eyes widened when she saw Celine, then narrowed with calculation that came faster than fear. Celine's smile was vicious. Behind her, more guards were flooding into the throne room, weapons drawn, surrounding them. The mathematics suddenly brutal. 5 wolves against an army. Power against numbers. Rage against organized military force. They were going to die here. In the throne room where it all started, full circle. Poetic in the way tragedies always were when you looked back from the ending. But Celine found she didn't care, because dying here meant taking Morgana with her, meant freezing the throne itself, meant ensuring that Shadowfang Kingdom would never forget the name Celine Vale, or the price of believing weakness was permanent. She raised her hands, felt power gathering like a storm about to break, felt ice crystallizing in the air around her, felt the moment stretch toward violence that would define everything that came after. Then the walls exploded, not from inside, from outside, stone shattering inward, ancient creatures pouring through gaps in the castle defenses, beasts that shouldn't exist, monsters from nightmares made flesh, things with too many teeth and eyes that burned with hunger older than kingdoms. The ancient creatures had returned, and they were hungry for wolf blood. Guards forgot about Celine and her warriors, turned to face threats that made rebellion look insignificant, started dying before they could even raise their weapons. Kael was shouting orders, trying to organize a defense against things that shrugged off steel and tore through armor like paper, trying to protect his kingdom while it collapsed around him. And Celine stood in the center of the throne room, watching everything she had wanted to destroy being destroyed by something worse. Watching Kael fight desperately to save people who were already dead. watching the political machine that had ground her down being torn apart by forces that didn't care about pack hierarchy or mate bonds or the particular cruelty of court. The ancient Beast King emerged through the largest breach in the wall, 15 feet of scaled muscle and predatory intelligence, eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, power that made even Celine's newly awakened abilities look like a candle next to a wildfire. It looked at her, recognition in its gaze, something that might have been respect or might have been hunger. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding stone. The choice crystallized in that moment. Let them die. Let Kael and Morgana and every wolf who had hurt her be torn apart by monsters. Walk away while Shadowfang Kingdom burned and call it justice, or fight beside the mate who had betrayed her to save a kingdom that had never wanted her. The mathematics were brutally simple. Him or them. Revenge or survival. The satisfaction of watching them suffer, or the knowledge that she was strong enough to be better than they ever were. Celine looked at Kael fighting desperately against impossible odds. Looked at warriors dying to protect their families. Looked at the kingdom that had broken her and the man who had failed her and the throne that had never been hers. She made her choice. Celine stepped forward, between the Beast King and the castle. Between extinction and survival. Between rage and something that might have been mercy if you looked at it from the right angle. Frost exploded from her hands, ice crystallizing faster than thought. Winter itself made weapon. The Beast King smiled, all teeth and anticipation. Then the real battle began. The Beast King moved first. 15 feet of scaled muscle and predatory intelligence launched across the throne room faster than something that size should have been able to move. Claws the length of swords carved through stone where Celine had been standing a heartbeat before. She rolled left, came up with frost already spreading from her palms, and sent a spear of ice straight at the creature's exposed throat. It shattered against scales that had survived centuries. The Beast King didn't even flinch. Behind her, Kael was shouting orders to warriors who were already dying. Smaller creatures were pouring through the breached walls. Things with too many limbs and mouths that opened wrong and hunger that had been building since they were sealed away generations ago. The throne room had become an abattoir, blood on marble, screaming that would haunt whoever survived long enough to remember. Celine ducked under another strike that would have taken her head off, watched the Beast King's claws embed in a stone pillar, saw the moment of vulnerability when it had to wrench its hand free. She went for the eyes. Frost exploded from her fingertips in a concentrated blast. The creature roared and stumbled back, one massive paw coming up to protect its face. Not fast enough. Ice spread across its left eye, crystallizing the delicate tissue, blinding it on that side. First blood, first proof that these things could be hurt. The Beast King's remaining eye fixed on her with something that might have been respect or might have been rage. When it spoke, its voice carried across the chaos like thunder. It came at her again, this time with the calculated precision of something that had learned she was dangerous. Feinting left, striking right, using its bulk to corner her against the wall, testing her speed, her reflexes, her ability to maintain power output when exhaustion started setting in. Because that was the brutal mathematics of this fight. The Beast King had centuries of experience and strength that dwarfed anything she had encountered. Celine had 6 weeks of training and power she was still learning to control. The longer this went on, the more likely she made a mistake that cost her life. She needed an advantage, needed something the creature didn't expect, needed to stop fighting like prey and start thinking like the predator her bloodline had been bred to become. Ira's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere behind her. Celine risked a glance over her shoulder, saw Ira and the survivors fighting back-to-back against a tide of smaller creatures, saw Kael leading a desperate defense near the throne, saw Morgana standing motionless beside the king's seat, calculating odds with the cold precision of someone who had survived decades of court politics by knowing exactly when to cut losses. The Queen Mother's eyes met Celine's across the carnage. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the acknowledgement that survival mattered more than grievances when extinction was the alternative. Morgana's voice carried the authority of someone who had ruled before Kael was born. Warriors who had been fighting independently suddenly moved with coordination, forming defensive lines, protecting each other's flanks, creating space for Celine to maneuver without worrying about smaller creatures at her back. The Beast King noticed the shift. Its remaining eye tracked the organized response. Recognition flickered across features too alien to read clearly. When it spoke again, there was something different in its tone. Not respect, fear. It charged. Not at Celine. At the throne itself. At Morgana standing beside the symbol of Shadowfang's power. At the political heart of the kingdom. Celine moved without thinking, threw herself between the creature and its target, felt claws rake across her side, pain bright and immediate, blood hot against skin that had gone cold from channeling power. Her vision blurred, but she stayed upright through sheer will. Because that was what the weak Luna everyone had mocked could do now. Stand between extinction and survival. Take hits that would kill normal wolves. Bleed for a kingdom that had never wanted her and call it choice instead of obligation. The Beast King's momentum carried it past her, gave her the opening she needed. She pressed both palms against its scaled back and poured everything she had into one concentrated burst of cold. Frost spread beneath the scales, into muscle, into bone, freezing from the inside out. The creature roared and tried to throw her off, but she held on, fingers digging into flesh, power flowing like water, finding cracks, finding weakness, finding the vulnerable core beneath armor that had survived centuries. The Beast King's movement slowed, ice crystallizing along its spine, joints locking up. The particular paralysis that came when cold reached vital systems and started shutting them down one by one. It tried to speak. Words came out slurred, confused. The intelligence fading as hypothermia claimed higher brain function. Then it collapsed. 15 feet of apex predator brought down by a woman who had spent 3 years being told she was worthless. By power that had been dormant so long, everyone forgot it existed. By the particular rage of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Celine stood over the fallen Beast King, breathing hard, blood dripping from the wounds in her side. Around her, the smaller creatures were hesitating, watching their leader die, calculating odds that had just shifted dramatically. She raised her voice. Let it carry across the throne room with authority she hadn't known she possessed. The creatures looked at their fallen king, looked at the woman standing over it with ice coating her hands and murder in her eyes, looked at the organized resistance that had formed behind her. Then they ran, back through the breached walls, into the wilderness beyond the kingdom's borders, fleeing from a threat they hadn't anticipated and couldn't overcome, leaving behind bodies and destruction and the particular silence that came after violence ended but before anyone could process what had just happened. Celine stood in the center of the throne room and felt her legs give out. She collapsed beside the frozen corpse of the Beast King, pain from her wounds catching up with adrenaline, exhaustion from maintaining that level of power output for that long, finally overwhelming her system. Her vision was going dark at the edges, her breathing was shallow, blood loss and power depletion combining to drag her toward unconsciousness, whether she wanted it or not. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Kyle running toward her, his face twisted with something that might have been fear or might have been grief. His hands reaching for her like he could hold her together through will alone. Then nothing. When Celine woke, she was lying in a bed that wasn't hers but felt familiar anyway. Soft sheets, the smell of healing herbs, sunlight filtering through windows that overlooked gardens she recognized. She was back in the castle, in the healing wing where injured warriors were brought after battles, where broken bones were set and wounds were stitched and wolves either recovered or didn't, depending on how much damage they had taken. She tried to sit up, pain lanced through her side, and she gasped. A hand pressed gently against her shoulder, easing her back down. Era's voice was quiet. Celine turned her head. The old woman was sitting beside the bed, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The kind of tired that came from surviving when everyone else died. From walking through the ruins of your people and deciding whether revenge mattered more than rebuilding. Celine's voice came out as a whisper. Era's smile was sad. The words settled over Celine like a weight. 3 days. 3 days she had been unconscious while her body tried to heal from wounds that should have killed her. 3 days the kingdom had been dealing with the aftermath of an attack that nearly ended them. 3 days Kyle had been ruling without knowing if the woman who saved them would ever wake up. Celine stared at the ceiling. White plaster, cracks spreading from the corners like fractures in ice. The kind of damage that happened when ancient creatures tried to tear down walls that had stood for centuries. Era stood slowly, joints protesting movement after sitting too long. She left before Celine could argue, left her alone with thoughts that had been waiting 3 days to surface. Thoughts about what came next. About whether saving the kingdom meant she belonged here now or if it just meant she had paid a debt and could finally leave without guilt. About whether the mate bond that had broken could be rebuilt or if some fractures were permanent. The door opened again an hour later. Footsteps that she recognized before she saw who they belonged to. Heavy, measured. The walk of someone who carried authority like a physical weight. Kael stood in the doorway. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. Face gaunt, eyes shadowed, clothing rumpled like he had been wearing it for days. The carefully maintained composure he always projected was gone. What remained was just a man who had watched his kingdom nearly fall, and the woman he failed almost die saving it. They stared at each other across the room. Too much history, too many wounds. The mate bond that had once connected them was a ghost now. Something that had existed once but was so damaged it barely registered. Kael spoke first. His voice was rough. Celine pushed herself to sitting despite the pain. She needed to face this conversation upright. Needed whatever came next to happen while she had some dignity left. Kael moved into the room, pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. His hands were shaking. She had never seen his hands shake before. The silence stretched. Outside the window, she could hear the kingdom beginning to rebuild. Hammers on stone, voices calling orders, life continuing because it had to even when the world had just tried to end. Finally, Kael found words. Celine's laugh was bitter. Kael's jaw tightened, pain flickering across his features before control buried it. The admission hung in the air between them, raw, honest. The kind of truth that only came when you had lost everything and realized pretending didn't matter anymore. Celine looked at the man who had been her mate, at the king who had chosen his throne over his queen, at the alpha who had learned too late that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with words or time or the desperate hope that love would survive anything. She thought about this past 3 years, the humiliation, the slow erosion of self-worth, the nights spent alone wondering what was wrong with her that she couldn't shift or fight or be the Luna everyone needed. The morning she fled because dying in the mountains felt better than dying slowly in the castle. She thought about the village that had taken her in, the training that had forged her into something dangerous, the massacre that had turned grief into rage and sent her back here with murder in her heart. She thought about standing between the Beast King and the throne, about the choice to fight for a kingdom that had never wanted her, about bleeding for people who had mocked her weakness and calling it her decision instead of obligation. She thought about power, real power, the kind that didn't come from dominance or fear, but from being strong enough to protect things even when they didn't deserve protection. Strong enough to forgive when revenge would have been easier. Strong enough to choose mercy when justice demanded blood. That was the lesson the mountains had taught her. That was what 6 weeks of brutal training had really been about. Not learning to kill, learning to choose. Learning that power without wisdom was just another form of weakness. That strength without compassion made you into the monsters you were supposed to be fighting. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Kael's eyes widened, hope flickering to life before caution buried it. Celine continued before he could interrupt. Kael was nodding, desperate, willing to agree to anything if it meant she stayed. Celine held up a hand. She paused. Let the words settle. Let him understand exactly what she was demanding. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what she was asking. Because this wasn't about power dynamics or political positioning. This was about recognizing that she had been right all along. That the mate bond choosing her hadn't been a mistake. That weakness was never permanent. That the woman everyone dismissed had always been capable of this. She just needed space to become it without being crushed by expectations she couldn't meet. Kael's eyes were burning. Not with anger, with something that looked like grief and hope, and the desperate understanding of someone who had lost everything and was being given one last chance to make it right. His voice cracked when he spoke. He slid from the chair to his knees beside the bed. An alpha king kneeling before his Luna. Not because pack hierarchy demanded it, because she had earned it through blood and ice and the particular courage of standing between extinction and survival when running would have been easier. He reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers closed around hers carefully, like she was made of glass, like he was afraid one wrong move would shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between them. Celine looked down at their joined hands. His were shaking, hers were steady. The shift in power dynamics so complete it would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. She met his eyes. Kael nodded. Face twisted with emotion he was barely containing. Over the next weeks, the kingdom rebuilt. Walls were repaired. Dead were honored. Families mourned. The survivors of the ancient creature attack were given the support they needed to process trauma and begin healing. Warriors who had fought beside Celine were promoted, given positions of honor, recognized for standing against extinction when running would have been rational. And Celine stood beside Kael in the throne room while they addressed the court, while they announced that the Luna everyone had dismissed had returned, that she would be taking her rightful place as queen, that the kingdom owed her their lives and anyone who questioned her worth would answer to the Alpha King himself. Morgana was there, standing to the side with an expression that might have been approval or might have been the cold calculation of someone who had spent decades reading power dynamics and understood exactly what had shifted. When the formal announcements were done, when the court had dispersed, and it was just Celine and the Queen Mother in the now empty throne room, Morgana spoke. Celine turned to face the woman who had made her life unbearable, the woman who had pushed and criticized and made it clear every day that Selene was inadequate, the woman who had essentially driven her from the castle. Part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to hold on to rage as justification for everything she had suffered. But rage was exhausting. Rage consumed you from the inside out if you let it, and she had learned in the mountains that survival meant knowing when to fight and when to let go. Morgana studied her with those calculating eyes. Celine's jaw tightened. Morgana's smile was sharp. The admission hung between them. Not an apology. Morgana Draven didn't apologize, but an acknowledgement, a recognition that she had misjudged, that her attempts to strengthen the kingdom by removing what she saw as weakness had nearly cost them everything. Celine looked at the woman who had tormented her and felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Recognition that Morgana had been doing what she thought necessary to protect her son's kingdom. That sometimes people hurt you not because they're evil, but because they're afraid and fear makes you cruel. That didn't make it right, didn't erase the damage, but it made it comprehensible in a way that pure malice never was. When Celine spoke, her voice was level. Morgana's eyes widened fractionally. Then she nodded, respect settling across features that had never shown Celine anything but contempt. She turned to leave, paused at the door and looked back one final time. Then she was gone and Celine was alone in the throne room where it had all started, where she had been humiliated and rejected and slowly broken under the weight of being inadequate, where she had stood 2 months ago and listened to the Queen Mother explain exactly why she would never be good enough. She walked to the throne, ran her fingers across the carved armrest, felt the weight of history in the stone, felt the echo of every ruler who had sat here and made decisions that determined who lived and who died. She could sit here now, could claim the power that came with the position, could rule beside Kael as his equal and watch the kingdom that had rejected her kneel at her feet. The thought didn't bring the satisfaction she expected. Just a quiet recognition that power for its own sake was hollow, that revenge consumed more than it returned, that being strong enough to destroy something meant you were also strong enough to choose not to. That was what growing up really meant, not gaining power, but learning when not to use it. Footsteps behind her, Kael's presence filling the space. He came to stand beside her, didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood there while she processed everything that had brought them to this moment. Finally, he broke the silence. Celine looked at him, at the man who had been her mate, who had failed her when she needed him most, who was trying now with desperate sincerity to rebuild something that might never be what it was. She thought about the past 3 years, the pain, the humiliation, the slow death of self-worth. Then she thought about the mountains, the training, the moment she stood over the Beast King and chose to save a kingdom that had never wanted her. She thought about who she had been and who she had become, and the brutal journey between those two versions of herself. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of truth earned through survival. She turned to face him fully. Let him see the scars on her side where the Beast King's claws had torn through flesh. Let him see the ice-pale eyes that marked her as White Wolf bloodline. Let him see the woman who had walked into the mountains to die and came back strong enough to shake kingdoms. Cale's eyes were burning, his hands were shaking. The careful control he always maintained was fracturing under the weight of everything he was feeling. Celine reached out slowly, touched his face with fingers that still carried frost at the tips, felt him lean into the contact like a man dying of thirst finding water. Kael's laugh was broken. The honesty of it hit her harder than she expected, because that was the truth neither of them could escape. 3 years of damage, 2 months of separation, a massacre that she would carry with her forever. The knowledge that he had chosen his kingdom over his mate when it mattered most. Those wounds didn't disappear because she saved his people, didn't vanish because he finally understood what he had lost. They would always be there. Scars on a relationship that had been broken and might never fully heal. But scars were proof of survival. Proof that you had been hurt badly enough to leave marks and still chosen to keep living. And maybe that was what rebuilding looked like. Not pretending the damage didn't exist, but acknowledging it, carrying it, learning to live with the weight of what you had done to each other and choosing to try anyway. Celine's thumb traced across his cheekbone, gentle despite the violence her hands were capable of now. Something in Kael's expression broke, grief and hope, and desperate gratitude combining into emotion too complex for words. He caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm, the gesture so careful it hurt to witness. They stood in the throne room while sunlight filtered through windows that had been shattered and repaired, while the kingdom rebuilt around them, while the future waited to be decided by two people who had destroyed each other and were trying to figure out if the pieces could be reassembled into something worth saving. Celine didn't have answers, didn't know if trust could be rebuilt or if love could survive this much damage, didn't know if she would ever stop seeing the faces of dead children when she closed her eyes, or if the rage that had driven her back here would fade or just settle deeper into her bones. She just knew she was tired, tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being defined by other people's expectations, or her own inadequacies, or the brutal mathematics of survival. She wanted rest, wanted peace, wanted the space to figure out who she was when she wasn't in crisis mode, wanted to discover if the woman who had learned to freeze hearts and topple kingdoms could also learn to build something instead of just tearing things down. Maybe that was possible here. Maybe Shadowfang Kingdom could become home instead of prison. Maybe the mate bond that had been shattered could be rebuilt into something stronger for having broken once. Or maybe she would wake up one morning and realize staying was just another form of dying slowly, that some damage was too deep to heal, that the kindest thing you could do for both of you was walk away before you destroyed each other completely. She didn't know, couldn't know, could only take it one day at a time and see if tomorrow looked better than yesterday, see if the weight got lighter or just shifted to different shoulders. See if strength meant staying or leaving or something in between that she hadn't figured out yet. But for now, in this moment, standing in the throne room with Kael's hand in hers and sunlight painting the repaired walls gold, she made a choice. She chose to try. Not because she owed him anything, not because the kingdom demanded it, not because the mate bond required it, but because she wanted to. Because after everything she had survived, she had earned the right to make choices based on what she wanted, instead of what everyone else needed. And right now, standing here with the possibility of something better within reach, she wanted to see if they could build it. That was power. Real power. The kind that didn't come from dominance or fear or the ability to freeze blood in veins. It came from being strong enough to choose, strong enough to forgive, strong enough to try again even when every rational instinct said, protect yourself at all costs. It came from surviving the worst thing that could happen to you and deciding you were still going to build a life worth living on the other side. Celine looked at Kael and smiled, small, genuine, the first real smile she had given him since before everything fell apart. Kael's answering smile was tentative, hopeful, like he was afraid to believe this was real. They left the throne room together, walked through corridors being rebuilt, past warriors who straightened and saluted when they passed, through gardens where new growth was pushing up through scorched earth, into a future that was uncertain and fragile and theirs to build. And somewhere in the mountains, where ancient bloodlines slept beneath snow and ice, the land remembered that the white wolves had returned, that the power everyone thought was extinct had woken up, that the weak Luna who fled into the wilderness had become the thing kingdoms feared most. Not a conqueror, not a tyrant, just a woman who had learned that strength meant having the power to destroy and choosing mercy instead, having every reason for revenge and building something better, having nothing left to lose and deciding to gamble on hope anyway. That was the real ending, not victory, not triumph, just the quiet beginning of something that might become beautiful if they were brave enough to let it. The forsaken Luna had come home, and this time she was staying on her own terms.